Well, hello, everyone. I'm Grace Royalty, and on behalf of the CBA's Professionalism Committee, I'd like to welcome you to the second talk in our three-part series of Take 10 Talks. First, just a couple of housekeeping matters. There's going to be a 10-minute talk, which will be recorded and then uploaded to the CBA's website. If you could, please turn off your cameras during that time. Then we'll have a 30-minute question and answer session, which will not be recorded. You're welcome at that time and actually encouraged to turn your cameras back on and ask questions. So today's Take 10 talk is presented by Detective Joe Keating. Detective Keating is a third-generation attorney. His grandfather is the former Judge William Keating, and his father is Bill Keating. He graduated from UC Law School in 2012. During law school and then briefly after law school, he worked for Judge Hildebrand in the Ohio First District Court of Appeals. He joined the Cincinnati Police Department in 2014 and was assigned to Districts 1 and 2 before coming into his current role investigating fraud and white-collar crime in the Financial Crime Squad. Detective Keating also teaches classes at the Cincinnati Police Academy in the legal section, as well as report writing and interview and interrogation. He's taught a number of CLE classes through the Cincinnati Bar Association and the Lawyers Club. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Detective Keating. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Like you said, I'm Joe Keating, work for the Cincinnati Police Department. One of the things when I started law school the very first week, now Justice Fisher came to talk to us during orientation, and he told us nobody likes lawyers because if when you're ever meeting with the lawyers, something bad has happened, something negative happened, or you're going to have something or a conversation where something negative has come up, like even you're forming a business, you're going to have a conversation. What happens if my business partner and I's relationship falls out, or what happens if the business fails? Then you go fast forward, 5 years later. So I'm saying the police academy, the police chief comes up and starts talking to us and says, nobody likes the police. The reason nobody likes the police is because whenever you're dealing with the police, something bad has happened. So even if you have been invited to the police to come to you because your house is broken into, your car is broken into, you're involved in a crash, something bad happened, you prefer not to be there. So that's kind of where there's a lot of overlap that people don't necessarily understand between law enforcement and the legal profession. Is we're dealing with people who are in crises all the time. Some people are in a minor crisis, their car was broken into. Some people are in a major crisis, they're dealing with a death or something like that. So the main topic of this speech is kind of dealing with those crises and de-escalation techniques and learning how to solve the problems through listening to people, because that's ultimately what de-escalation, that whole concept is learning how to listen to people to be able to solve their problems. And one thing I want to let everybody know is there's one little secret to law enforcement and de-escalation that people don't always understand or they overlook. Almost all of our interactions with people are with people who invited us to be there. The victims of the crime, people involved in traffic crashes and so on, not so much with the quote unquote bad guys or whatever, like is always depicted in the news media, but most of the stuff we're dealing with is people who want us there to help them solve the problem. And it's kind of the same way with you. So as I said, de-escalation is crisis intervention. When I started the police academy, they didn't have the term de-escalation. It was called crisis intervention. So those two, then when de-escalation became, the hot button buzzword, it became de-escalation from crisis intervention. And at its core, the main thing you're trying to do is solve problems. And in order to solve the problem, you need to know what the problem is. In law school, we call that issue spotting. You get the problems, so then be able to find out what the issues are to be able to solve them from there. In order to know what the problem is, you also have to be able to listen to what the person is saying. I'm sure that the next time somebody comes to your office, they're going to be giving you a fact pattern that's quite similar to other cases that you've dealt with before. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the exact same as the previous issue you dealt with. So you've got to be able to learn how to listen to them. In order to be able to actually listen to them and solve the problem, you have to be able to make that person comfortable enough to talk to you. As I said, people are going through a crisis, they're going through a problem, some stuff they may not be as willing to want to share. And that's what the main gist of what this talk is about, learning how to open yourself up and allow people to be able to talk to you about their problems. So remember, you weren't there when the problem occurred. So the only way that you know how the problem occurred is to be able to listen to what somebody says occurred. So the whole block that we have on the police department involving all this stuff, it's about 4 or 5 hours in the police academy. I'm not going to give you 4 or 5 hours, so I'm just going to hit a couple highlights that I find to be rather important things that people always kind of take it for granted, don't always listen to, or don't necessarily understand. First thing is silence is a great communication tool. Sometimes people want to pause in their speech to gather their thoughts or to build the courage of what they're saying. And if you're going to, every time somebody pauses in their speech, you immediately give them a follow-up question, they may interpret that as you interrupting them. Those interruptions can be created you as being having a low frustration tolerance. If you got a low frustration tolerance, people aren't going to be as willing to want to open up and talk to you about some of these very personal issues that they're going through. And also using pauses in your own speech. Part of listening is also talking back to people. You've got to be able to convey that you are listening to them. So using pauses in your own speech when you're talking to somebody to help emphasize a point back to them. You know, if somebody's conveying an emotion, you want to relay that emotion back to them. You say, I understand you are upset, and then issue a pause right there. Let them know that you've got a connection going on. And then also try to reiterate the events of what happened. Remember, you weren't there. Sometimes people aren't always using the exact same terms or words that you necessarily understand. Different words have different meanings. Somebody's car gets broken into, they always say they were robbed. We're all lawyers. We know that that's a theft offense. It's not a robbery because there's no force involved or no physical force or violence against somebody. But that's where that whole thing comes in. So they're going to use the term rob. That doesn't mean they're literally robbed. Another one that I've learned from taking Spanish is the verb molestar. In Spanish, that kind of means that somebody's annoying you or bothering you. So we deal with a lot of Spanish-speaking communities in Cincinnati. So if somebody's saying, one of those communities saying that, you know, their uncle's molesting them, that doesn't necessarily mean what we might necessarily interpret that to mean. So you want to be able to understand what they're saying and issue things back to them. You also want to try to give them those minimal encouragements, the verbal or nonverbal clues that indicate that you're paying attention to them. Obviously, the ones that everybody always talks about are the, you know, the ahas, the go-ons, the okays, nodding your head forward. Also, something as simple as leaning into the person you're talking to. You're opening up yourself to them to let them know that you are comfortable with them. They can be comfortable to you. You want to invite them to share. The situation is uncomfortable for everyone involved. I'm sure that we've all been in a situation where somebody's sharing with us and we don't want to listen to it because it's uncomfortable for us to hear. But in order for us to help solve that problem and start that healing process for whoever we're dealing with, we need to give them permission to share and understand that they can share with us. Give them those permission. Another last thing is, you know, to ask open-ended questions. You know, a lot of times you want to try to get to the gist of the problem right away, but the way that people remember things isn't always the way you want them to remember things. One of the things I picked up really quickly on when I was working patrol shifts, especially in District 1, is if a person was a victim of a robbery, you ask them to describe the suspect. They will, if you just broadly ask them, can you describe the suspect for me? They will start and they will always give a very, very vivid, in-depth detail of the person's shoes. And that kind of seems like that's not a very good detail, because how does that help us solve the issue? You know, they can give you a very in-depth, detailed description of the shoes, but they can't tell you how old they were, whether they had a beard, whether they're wearing a hat, what color their eyes are, you know, stuff that would be more valuable than being able to identify. But then when you kind of stop, you think about it, somebody points a gun in your face, they ball their fist up towards you, threatening you. What's your natural inclination to do? You're going to stare down at their feet. And so that's why they're always able to give the in-depth description of the shoes. So if you immediately start with something like, what color were their eyes? Were they wearing a hat? You know, there's more narrowly tailored questions, and they don't know the answer to that. They're going to kind of feel a little bit more embarrassed about what's going on, and they might close up a little bit more, not be as willing to share. Whereas if you let them share the stuff that they do know, that might help them refresh their recollection a little bit more and invite them a little bit more to talk back to you. You also want to try to build a little bit of rapport. You want to be honest and sincere. Unfortunately, one of the things we have to do on a regular basis with the police department is we have to give death notifications. That's never uncomfortable for us. It's never uncomfortable for the other person, but we very specifically always say this person is dead. We don't say they passed away, they're in a better place. You want to get straight to the point, be honest, sincere with them, because you don't want them to have to start thinking about what could this possibly mean. Straight to the point, be honest, sincere. You also want to give them forewarning that certain things are going to take place. If you're somebody's going through a slip and fall case, and it's like, hey, you might have to sit through a deposition, and there's going to be a big bad lawyer on the other side of things that's going to, really grill you and ask you a lot of hard questions that you might not necessarily be comfortable answering those questions, which is why we've got to have this discussion right now. But you've also got to warn them about what's coming ahead, because if you just kind of surprise it on them, they aren't going to want to trust you moving forward. Also trying to be patient, matching the speed and volume of their voice just to kind of like a certain extent. If somebody's shouting, you're not going to shout back at them, but you also don't want to, talk back to them in a whisper, because they're not going to think you guys are on the same wavelength. So just being able to match them a little bit in the way that they're speaking can help you build that rapport with them. Also, maintaining that calm tone of voice. One thing that people, if you're a lawyer, you're a police officer, you're on scene, you're talking to somebody, you've got a certain aura of authority about you. Your presence alone can kind of like de-escalate the situation in of itself. It can add some credibility. So if you're maintaining your calmness around them while they're opening up, sharing their whole story about all these terrible things that happened to them, if you're remaining calm, they will be calm. I know we often joke when we have the fire department, the medics respond on scene, they usually are walking, they're usually not running towards us. If the fire department's ever running towards you to get to you, there's probably a bigger problem. But if they're, keeping their pace, just walking calmly, that can kind of help alleviate the situation, help people calm down. You also don't want to minimize or discount their point of view. Like I said, the next person you meet with probably is not going to have the biggest problem you've ever dealt with. It's probably not going to be the biggest issue you've ever dealt with or the worst thing you've ever dealt with. But to them, that is the biggest issue they've ever dealt with. I might respond to a shooting early in the night, then about an hour later, I'm going to a little fender bender property damage and like traffic crash. Obviously, the shooting's a much more serious, severe issue. However, this little fender bender traffic crash is a major problem for the person who's involved with it. If your car's totaled, what are the immediate things that are going through your mind? It's not, oh, well, I have insurance, this is going to get taken care of. It's how am I going to get to work? How am I going to be able to pick my kids up from school? How am I going to be able to get groceries? How much is this going to cost me? Stuff like that. So what they're going through is a major crisis, even if in the grand scheme of things, it's not necessarily the biggest problem in the world, but you've kind of got to understand that for them, it is. Also, there's the whole thing about people being brutally honest. When people are being brutally honest, they typically care more about the brutality than the honesty. So there's a difference between, being straightforward and honest with them and kind of like putting somebody down. So you don't want to minimize or discount other people's point of views. And the last thing you want to do is kind of like validate some of the positive things that they've done. A lot of times people, when they get involved in these situations where they need the police, they need a lawyer, they can be kind of embarrassed about something that happened to them. They got taken advantage of, or, they were hurt, they're something like that, or they're running through their mind, what could I have done to prevent this from happening? So that's another reason why they want to shut off to you, not be as open with you, but be like, hey, you're coming to my office, you want to help solve this problem, I want to help solve this problem too, we're making right steps here. Also, hey, you've recognized the problem, it might have been a little bit late, but you recognize the problem, we're working to fix that too. So validate some of the positive things that they've done. And so those are kind of just the main kind of points that I want to try to get across to that kind of relay more so to ways to build rapport, be able to communicate with people, be able to listen to them and let them open and share. So I believe at this time we can open things up to a little bit more questions.
Well, thank you. That was terrific. Let's give him a big round of applause. And at this time, if you all would like to turn your cameras back on, and if you have any questions, you can turn your mics on as well.